Of Melbourne. Welcome, Kelly.
Great. Clicker. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, great. Okay. Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to see so many diverse faces in the room and so many people from councils as well. And I think that you're going to see some real alignment in some of the things that we've been thinking about in Melbourne with the talk that Simon just gave. So great to see we're on the same page. So the City of Melbourne endorsed our urban forest strategy, our first strategy, in 2012. So we are just past a decade into it. The strategy goes for a 20-year period. So that's the halfway point for us. So we've been doing some reflection on that, looking at what's working, what's been challenging, and I'm going to share some of the things that we've found so far in this presentation. What I will say is that, just for a bit of context setting, the urban forest strategy provides high-level targets, so things like doubling tree canopy cover, creating a resilient urban forest so that we are resilient to pests and diseases and climate change and those kind of risks. And other targets you can see on the screen there. So the urban forest strategy provides those targets for the whole city. It's largely focused on the public realm, so those targets are focused on our area, the area of land that we manage, and our trees. And those targets apply to the whole city. Then we have a suite of what we call precinct plans. They're neighbourhood implementation plans that tell us how we will achieve those targets in the individual neighbourhoods around the city. The precinct plans only span 10 years. So for each neighbourhood under the urban forest strategy, there'll be 2 iterations of the precinct plan. So it gives us a chance to recalibrate. And this is the process we're going through at the moment. So we do this in a staggered way. We would all be very stressed and anxious people if we tried to do all 10 in 1 year. So our team are working through them in phases. So it will take us about 4 years to renew these plans. So we're in the thick of community engagement and kind of refocusing for the next decade. The slide you can see on the screen here is a summary of some of the information. So the first thing we did in renewing these precinct plans is actually a quite detailed review of the first iteration of the plans. We included qualitative and quantitative data. We looked at what we were planting, where, what our canopy cover is in different areas. We looked at, we also spoke to the people who use the plans, both internally but also community, all the different stakeholders to understand what the opportunities are for improvement and what should be maintained, what's working really well. So one of the things that strikes me about this diagram, this shows our 10 precincts and it shows canopy cover and trees planted. And one of the things you'll notice, if you can read the very small numbers on the screen, is that planting has not been even in terms of numbers of trees in the different precincts. In fact, we've got some quite large variation. And so you can see, like the central city, for example, 1,300 trees. I think North and West Melbourne is closer to 10,000 trees. This is over the span of a decade. So we plant 3,000 trees a year across the entire municipality. That's our target based on modelling to achieve our 40% canopy cover target. But that target doesn't dictate exactly where those trees should go. So if you look at Parkville, which is up the top, that's had nearly 15,000 trees planted there in a decade. So there's huge variation, is one of the things we picked up pretty quickly here. That's not necessarily a problem, provided that the trees are going in the areas where they're needed. So like many cities around the world, Melbourne's made up of different neighbourhoods with different legacies of tree planting, different land use types. The more affluent suburbs tend to be largely residential property with good setbacks from the street, with wide streets, lots of space for street trees, lots of open spaces with places for trees to go, and long history of trees being actively planted in those places. And then some other suburbs are more industrial, perhaps being converted to residential, probably really high density, not a great legacy of tree planting. And so not all precincts are starting from the same base. That's what you can see here. This diagram or this chart shows starting canopy cover levels for the different precincts across the city. And so you can see on the left here, Docklands, Fisherman's Bend, really starting from a very low canopy cover base. Not a lot of trees there, all the way up to somewhere like South Yarra, which is almost at the 40% target at the start of the strategy in 2012. So we don't need to plant, if we want 40% canopy cover across the whole city, we shouldn't be planting the same number of trees in each neighbourhood. So the question really is, are we planting them where they need to go? And what we found is, no, we're not. I apologise, the dots are really hard to see, I realise, but these dots show, using the right-hand axis, the numbers of trees planted in the decades. And so what you can see is some areas, like Docklands here, we have planted, there's been a pretty sustained tree planting effort there, and that's an area of low canopy cover. But that's not true for all of the areas of low canopy cover. So somewhere like Fisherman's Bend, starting with low canopy cover, but also when we reflect on how many trees have gone in there, not really where it should be. So I don't say this as a criticism of the work that the team are doing. We've been working absolutely flat chat for a decade, trying to get trees in anywhere we can. And the challenges that Simon talked about, this is very real. It's hard to get trees into these spaces. So we're working really hard. But what this tells us is that we need to be much more deliberate in the way that we think about distribution of greening in the city. So what you'll see over the next decade is much more of a focus on equity and planting in places, because one of the things I think is going on here is that tree planting in streets is easier in some of those suburbs where there are those wider streets. Like it is easier. And so I think here you see a little bit of what's going on is low-hanging fruit. So we've got to hit this 3,000 trees every year target, and that can have a bit of a perverse impact in that we just need to get 3,000 trees in, and that blunt number doesn't always tell you whether they're going where they need to. So we need to be much more deliberate about planting in the places where maybe it's not so easy, and that can have cost implications as well, but that needs to be more of a focus. When you look at this diagram, so this shows canopy cover over time in each precinct. And so you can see that the trend overall is going up, and that's good. Now, this is a 20-year period, so this starts a decade before our urban forest strategy came in. And I should say that's been one of the key successes of the urban forest strategy is the commitment to monitoring. So we made a commitment at the start of the strategy that was endorsed by council that said we will report publicly on tree canopy cover in the public realm every year. Now, my personal opinion is that's perhaps a little bit too frequent in hindsight. I think maybe 3 to 5 years might have been a better sweet spot for that. What we find is, it's an expensive thing to do. So we have a budget of $100,000 every year for monitoring, and that's usually acquisition of multispectral imagery, LiDAR, something like that to actually help us report on canopy cover. But the noise that you get, you're talking about really slow incremental change, and the noise that you get when reporting annually, I feel like we're constantly explaining to councillors why there's a margin of 1% up or down or whatever, and you can't always explain these things. So I think it's the broader trend is probably the thing we need to be reporting on. But regardless, having that commitment has allowed us to get the budget to track canopy cover over time, and that helps us to actually understand what's going on. So what you can see here is that canopy cover across the board is going up, perhaps not as fast as we would like, and some precincts have a much bigger gap between where they are and that 40% canopy cover target. And so this is where the equity thing is really important. When we look at the city as a whole, and canopy cover, so our target is 40% in the public realm. We're, as of 2024 or late 2023 data, sitting at 25.2%. So the story here is that canopy cover is going up across the city, but it's not going up at the rate that was predicted in the modelling that underpins the strategy. And so what does that mean? That means we are not on track to hit our 40% canopy cover target. Initial estimates have us hitting mid-30s in terms of percentage cover by 2040. So the challenge for us in the next decade is how do we ramp this up? How do we bridge that gap? How do we actually accelerate that kind of rate of growth? And we do expect, the modelling suggests that we will see greater canopy gains in the second decade of the strategy as all these thousands of young trees we plant, really start to hit their straps and really grow canopy. But even so, we're not quite where we would like to be. And so then the question is why? We had a local consulting group, Player Piano Data Analytics, who specialise in tree canopy monitoring and data. They did a 20-year retrospective canopy cover assessment for the city and basically got access to whatever free data they could find, aerial imagery, whatever information we had, things like LiDAR, and tidied up our data over a 20-year period. So that allows us to do things like growth modelling, look at individual trees and understand how they're changing over time. So what you can see here is a chart that they prepared in their most recent report for us, and it's a colour scale which I appreciate is a little bit difficult to see. But essentially, this starts to tell us a little bit of what's going on with our canopy cover. So you can see each of these bars on the right-hand side is a year from the start of the strategy. The green shows growth, the red shows decline. And so you can see our canopy cover is growing. And it's broken up into two sections. So growth of canopy cover from planting new trees, and that's a darker green section, and you can see that that's the smaller part. For the most part, the canopy gains we're seeing are the trees that are there, existing trees, are growing. So that's great. And they're not growing at an insignificant rate. However, what this also tells us is that that canopy gain is being negatively offset by removals, mature tree removals. And that's what's shown in the red there, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years. And so you can see there is there's a few things that contribute to this. Some of it is tree health, and there will always be a process of removing trees that are declining. We're not so concerned about that. That's a natural part of managing the urban forest. In some ways, there's an element of ripping off the Band-Aid and kind of saying if a tree is underperforming, take it out, put something new in, get it in a really good growing environment and let that kind of, really provide the gains that it can. The more concerning part is removals that are from, I'd say it's 3 key things. Private development impacting public trees adjacent to those sites, particularly in examples where they're building right up to the property line. Major projects have been a huge factor, especially over the last 3 years. So when I say major projects, I mean like state government projects, things like rail projects, major freeway projects. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of trees in the city being removed for these kind of major infrastructure projects. And then the third one is council projects, and that's particularly challenging. There's plenty of examples of where our own capital works are removing a lot of our trees. Oftentimes the designer's like a clean slate that's easier to work with, and so that's a real struggle for us. One of the key mechanisms we have to sort of prevent this loss is our tree policy, and this has largely been successful over the last decade. Our tree policy was endorsed at the same time as the urban forest strategy, and essentially works by saying we won't remove trees unless we absolutely have to, and you can demonstrate that there's no other options for redesign or something like that. If we do agree to remove a tree, there must be an improved greening outcome, more trees, better growing environment, something like that. We will charge fees for the value of the trees when we remove them, and we hold bonds. So we also use that value to, we'll charge a bond for the value of the trees that are covered by a tree protection plan. And we know from experience, comparing projects where those bonds are in place and where they're not, they're highly effective at ensuring compliance with our tree protection plans. So this policy has been largely successful. It's become very much business as usual in Melbourne. Developers expect that they will have to pay if they want to remove trees, and we've found that value on the tree to be a very motivating factor in considering alternative designs. So that's worked quite well. But what we know also is that we're still seeing removals. So there are opportunities to improve in the next decade in this policy space for us. One of the things we've done recently is introduce fees for pruning. So often a developer will say, well, we can keep the tree, but to get our crane in to do construction, we're going to need to, significantly prune this tree. We've introduced a fee for that, proportionate to the value of the tree. So you want to take out 20% of the canopy, it will cost you 20% of the value of the tree. And again, that's to try and disincentivise that kind of incremental loss of canopy cover. But we're also working on trying to get this policy, technically it applies to council projects as well, but that's not the way it works in practice. And we have a whole lot of contractors doing work for us all the time, and we don't have bonds in place. We don't have fees for tree removal because we'd be charging ourselves, but we need to, one area for us is really getting better compliance with this policy on our own projects. We've also had some success in the major project space working on canopy replacement. So often what we hear is the state government say, hey, we want to build this road, we're going to remove 100 trees, we'll give you 5 trees for every one. And that, really does not indicate whether or not you'll actually get that canopy back. It's not really a great metric. So we've had some success using canopy replacement ratios, so negotiating the Melbourne Metro project, for example, which is an underground rail project. They agreed to achieve 40% canopy cover within their project area by 2040. So outcome-based negotiation, which means that they're motivated to plant trees back, plant them in great growing environments, and retain trees, because that's the best way to achieve those targets, is not to remove the trees in the first place. So we're doing some things in this space. One of the other reflections on the first 10 years, and when we did this review of the precinct plans, was thinking about community engagement. And this is one of the things also contributing to canopy growth over time, is what happens when we get into streetscapes. So the precinct plans provide a map like this. It's a schedule. It tells us which are the priority streets and when do we intend to come in and do that planting over a 10-year period. This has been really successful because these documents are endorsed by council individually, and these maps have operated as basically a pipeline for capital works. They've given us a secure budget over a 10-year period because it's there, it's in the plan, it says when we will do it, it says what we will do, and so that helps us to get staff to deliver the work, ongoing budgets. So that's been really successful. However, interestingly, what we found, we take this map, the next step with this is when it comes to do one of these streets, we go out, we will look at the street, we'll look at maybe how we could rejig things to get more trees in, and then we'll come up with a plan, and then we'll engage with directly affected owners and occupiers in that area. At that point, we'll ask for majority support from those folks, and if we get the majority of people supportive, we'll go ahead and deliver the project. Now, we're sitting at about 2/3 of those streets being able to be implemented. About 1/3 of them can't be. Sometimes because the stakeholders in the street are not supportive. Sometimes it's because service situation is more complicated than we thought. Maybe we can't get sign off from traffic. All sorts of different things going on in different streets, but that number's pretty high, and that's something we'd like to see come down. So we're working with our strategic traffic teams to kind of try and work out whether we can pitch parking loss a bit differently, because we find that tends to be one of these really polarising issues, the perception of loss of parking. And one of the other things we're trying to do is build that broader base of support. So we did this in the first round of precinct plans and the urban forest strategy. We really spent a lot of time building a broad base of support for urban forest, and I would say we have that, but what we haven't seen is that translate into higher levels of support for greening when we come to the streetscape level. We would largely say that most of the objections, and sorry, some of the stuff you can see on the screen here is trying to reach out to different cultural groups. Lack of diversity is one of the challenges we see when we're doing this engagement. We tend to be preaching to the converted sometimes. I mean, people who want to come along to a workshop and talk about urban forest for a couple of hours tend to be the people who care about trees already. So we find it quite difficult to tap into different groups, like business groups and things like that. And also, Melbourne's a really multicultural place, and so we need to be better at providing material in different languages, making it easier for different folks to engage with us so we get an actually more representative view of what people think. NIMBYism though, so not in my backyard, or for Melbourne it's really probably not near my house. We don't have a lot of massive backyards in the city of Melbourne, centre of the city, but we hear this all the time. So I love trees, but, and then there's a perception about the disadvantage of having a tree directly near your property. Maybe there's concerns that it's going to damage your property, leaves, it's going to attract animals, all of these things are the reasons that we reckon when we go out with those plans to green a streetscape, we tend to see about 40% of folks initially not supportive. That's pretty high. And most of the time, those reasons fall under these kind of categories. This idea of, oh, I love trees. I'm supportive broadly, but just this one. I don't want this one. And that's what you see here. So this is a street in Carlton, quite a small street. We went out, we said, we reckon we can get 5 trees in where there weren't any before. And we ended up whittling it down to 2 trees because we just could not get people adjacent to these other ones to agree to have those trees there. So when we think about the canopy cover in the city across, the whole scale of the city, and where we're seeing this kind of reduction consistently every time we go into a street, this NIMBYism is really incrementally impacting our ability to hit our targets. And it's a tricky one to solve, and I don't have a solution here. The evidence, the research says that these deep-seated kind of perceptions are really hard to change. Just to sort of finish up here, and this ties in with what Simon was talking about, thinking about canopy cover into the future and what we need to focus more on. We don't have that much more space for trees in Melbourne. It's really built up, highly urbanised. Mass planting is not going to be the answer for us for canopy cover. It's going to mean we need to get more canopy for every tree that we plant. And that's really about budget, ultimately. Soil volume is key. We've looked at different examples around the city where we've done really expensive passive irrigation interventions and whatnot. And ultimately what we found is the consistent factor that gets that really quick, great canopy growth is soil volume. Passive irrigation is nice, but the soil volume is key. And so we need to ramp that effort up in the next decade. So we've got this budget it's called soil renewal budget or something. It's about $200,000 every year. If we're lucky, we can deliver maybe 30 trees, into, say, medians where we'll go in underperforming trees and maybe rip the soil out, put something new in, or maybe install some structural soil or something like that. But those kind of numbers, like that is a fraction. We're planting 3,000 trees every year. This budget is not going to cut it. So for us, the challenge is how do we get more money to support this kind of work? Probably costs us between $5,000 and $10,000 per tree to put it into like what we would consider absolute premium growing environment, maybe passive irrigation and all of the things you would want, massive soil volumes. So we'll be trying to pitch to council to increase this kind of budget. We have tried using tree removal fees. So this is an example. We've tried using our tree removal fees that we get through our policy to basically give money to other capital works projects. Like this one on the screen is a bike lane project, but we knew there was an opportunity in the centre median because they were changing the layout of the road that we could actually install structural soil trench and put some new trees in the middle. So we gave them $1 million to sort of piggyback off their project. That worked in that case, although some of the other examples where we've tried to do that, it's sort of been like we're subsidising a little bit of what they probably were going to deliver anyway as part of their project. So we're still trying to find the sweet spot on some of these things, but exploring different ways to fund this type of work. And the last thing I was going to mention, given the context of the chat today, and this is more so in the ecology space for our team, but one of the successes over the last 10 years has been shifting away from working with, say, large multinational consulting groups who maybe don't have that really subject matter expertise when we need to do a piece of work and we're engaging a consultant. We've started moving more towards partnerships with universities and academics, so consulting arrangements, but arranging that with an academic and a university instead. And so I won't go into all of these projects, but these are all examples of where we've done that. And the benefits are multiple. So for us, we were going to pay somebody to do some work anyway, maybe a study into something, maybe some strategic advice, maybe a review of what's going on in the market. We are going to spend the money anyway, so it's public money. We're better off actually contributing that to an academic institution, which helps them to employ academics, which is a pretty tricky space in Australia at the moment. It means that the outputs from that work will be published both in terms of the reports that we ask for, but also academically. And so you'll see there's a lot of academic literature coming out about projects that were delivered in the City of Melbourne, collaborative projects like the one you can see on the screen. There's a paper coming out very shortly about streetscape biodiversity sites where we tracked birds and bees and butterflies in understory planting in city streetscapes over a period of 5 years. That kind of thing, we were going to do it anyway, but by working with academics, we're able to actually make sure that knowledge is shared as broadly as it can, which I think is, really responsible use of public money. And it means that all the work we're doing is informed by the latest and best evidence that we can find. And so we're increasingly doing that much more than working with... We still work with consultants, specialist consultants in the subject area, but those kind of broader multinational kind of consultants, we're spending less money with them these days and working with academics instead. I'm going to leave it there, I think. I had another slide about diversity, but that was really just to say that the diversity targets are actually tracking quite well. It's one of the areas we're relatively happy with. We're more focused on kind of canopy covering, getting that up through below ground growing conditions. But I'll leave it there. Sorry, I've probably gone over time as well.
Who is monitoring Slido has a question.
Yep, that's cool. So there's a whole bunch of questions. Unfortunately, we won't get through all of them, which is probably good for you, but unfortunately for you, it's morning tea right after, so you guys will have a chance
Very happy to
counter.
chat.
I'll just see if we can get through the top 2 voted ones. The first one is, how are you valuing trees to decide on a bond? Wouldn't it be cheaper for the developers just to pay it?
For the developer to pay to remove the tree, do you mean? It's the same value. The difference is with a bond, you'll get it back if you look after the tree.
So how are you deciding on that bond?
Yeah, so we use, we've got our own valuation method, City of Melbourne valuation method. It's published on our website. You can see it there. It's based off the CTLA valuation approach, which comes out of the US, but basically it's a function of the size of the tree. So the larger the DBH, the larger the value will be. We've updated it in recent years to align more with our strategic goals. So, for example, Indigenous trees get a higher value because strategically they provide biodiversity benefits that we are interested in. Likewise, trees in areas with low canopy cover will have a higher value because that aligns with our strategic goals. So we tinker with it a little bit, but it's published on our website and largely accepted by the development community. And so we use that for fees, but also that's the bond. So at the moment we've got about $12 million sitting in bonds currently, the city, for a range of different projects, including bonds from the state government for the major transport projects. Highly effective at keeping people honest when it comes to tree protection. Not always. It's not foolproof, I will say that.
Cool, thank you, Kelly. I think we might have to leave it there for now, but if you have an opportunity, you are able to respond to all of these on Slido later if you so choose.
Great.
Could you just join me in thanking Kelly one more time?